Hello students, I welcome you all to this English class. Standard 10, Unit 6, the last lesson. Before we getting into the lesson, let's know about the author. The author of the lesson is Alphonse Daudet. He was a French novelist and short story writer. Formerly a school teacher, equipped to make a living as a journalist in Paris. He took to writing his poems collected into a volume called Les Amoureuses. His creativeness resulted in characters that were real and also typical. The last lesson is set in the days of Franco-Prussian War, in which France was defeated by Prussia, led by Bismarck. Prussia then consisted of what now are the nations of Germany, Poland, and parts of Austria. In this story, the French districts of Alsace and Lorraine have passed into Prussian hands. The story, the last lesson, highlights the pain that is inflicted on the people of a territory by its conquerors by taking away the rights to speak or study their own language. Before we getting into the explanation of this lesson, let's look at the glossary. The first word, chirping. Meaning of this word is making a short, sharp, high-pitched sound, usually by small birds or insects. The next word, bustle, meaning move in an energetic manner. The next word, unison, simultaneous utterance of words. The next word, rapping, striking with a series of rapid audible blows. The next word, thumped, a book which has been read often, bearing the marks of frequent handling. When you use any book frequently, so it naturally gets owned out. So one such book is called thumb. The next word, Saar. It's a river in northeastern France and western Germany. The next word, cranky, an adjective. The meaning, strange. The next word, Angelus, a Roman Catholic devotion commemorating the incarnation of Jesus and including Hail Mary, said at morning, noon, and sunset. And the last word, Vive la France. It is an expression used in French to show patriotism. It is difficult to translate the term literally into English, but it generally means long live France. So now let's see the gist of this story. In the last lesson, the author narrates events about the year 1870 when France was captured by Bismarck-led Prussian forces. Furthermore, the Lorraine and Alsace districts went under the Prussian rule. There was the discontinuation of teaching French in these two districts. There was an order for the French teachers to leave. Consequently, Mr. Hamel was not able to stay in his old school. In spite of this, the last lesson from him was full of devotion and sincerity. One student of Mr. Hamel was afraid of him. There was an anticipation of punishment from this student when he came to school that day. However, he learned that this will be his last lesson. Soon, he realized the importance of the subject. The story shows how people feel when they don't learn the language. Now let's go deep into the lesson. The narrator of the story is none other than a young school-going boy named Franz. Franz is a lazy boy. However, in spite of his laziness, Franz likes to play and is of a sensitive nature. Furthermore, Franz hates his teacher, Mr. Hamel, in his school and has no interest in studying French. It always happens when the students don't like the teacher, naturally they dislike the subject also. Likewise, it happens to Franz too. That fine morning, he was scared as he was late for the school. Also, as their teacher, Mr. Hamel, had announced the previous day that he would test them on the topic of participles, Franz did not know anything at all. He was more scared of being scolded. Franz had another option in his mind. He thought of running away and spending the day out of doors. He describes the scene. There were birds chirping on the trees, and the noise of the Prussian soldiers doing the drill behind the sawmill were tempting. But he resisted the temptation and hurried off to the school. Franz had another option in his mind. The scene outside was more attractive than the school, but Franz controlled the temptation and chose to attend the school. As Franz walked past the town hall, he noticed a huge crowd at the notice board. The war with Prussia had begun, and 2.5 years ago, and since then, all the bad news like losing the war, occupation of Alsace-Lorraine by the enemies, that is Prussia, etc., had been communicated to the people through this bulletin board. Franz kept on walking towards the school and thought to his mind that what news could have been put up at the board now. As he walked hurriedly towards the school, Blacksmith, who was also reading the news, had come along with his trainee, called out to Franz behind him and said he need not go in such a hurry, as there was plenty of time for him to reach the school. Franz thought the blacksmith was making fun of him, as he was already late for the school. When Franz reached the garden outside the school, he was out of breath as he had walked very fast. Franz describes the usual scene at the school in the morning. Usually, there would be a lot of noise created by the moving of desks, children repeating their lessons, the teachers striking the tables with the rulers could be heard. So, this is what a usual thing that happens in Franz's school. But something unusual happens the day. That day was unusual as there was no such sound coming out of the school. And it seemed that the school was closed as it used to be on Sunday morning. Sunday morning, if you see all the schools, it would be very silent. So it appeared for him that way. Franz had planned that he would take cover under the commotion and reach the class without being noticed. But what happened? But that did not seem possible. Franz peeped inside his class and saw his classmates seated and Mr. Hamel, their teacher, walking in the class with the ruler made up of iron placed under his arm. Franz feared a beating. Franz was ashamed of being late, and he feared a scolding as he had to enter the classroom in front of everyone. So naturally it happens when everyone has come into the school, when everyone has come into the classroom and seated, when someone comes late, he will feel ashamed of getting into the classroom. It happened to Franz also. Franz found it strange, as Mr. Hamel did not say anything, and on the contrary, politely asked him to get to his seat, as the class was about to begin without him. Franz hurried to his seat. After some time, when he overcame the scare and became comfortable, he noticed that their teacher had worn embroidered that day. The teacher normally wore it on the occasions, inspection and prize distribution days. Franz wondered if that day was a normal day. Then, what could be the reason for Mr. Hamel to wear his special dress? Franz felt that the atmosphere in the school was unusual and serious. To add to it, the last benches of the classroom were occupied by the senior village men. Hauser, who was wearing his three-cornered hat, the retired mayor, postmaster, and many were sitting. They all looked sad. Hauser had brought his reader, which was old and torn. He had opened it, kept it on his knees, and had placed his spectacles on it. Franz was confused and could not figure out what was happening that day. Just then, Mr. Hamel told them it was their last lesson in French, as the Prussians in Berlin had ordered that French language would no longer be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine, and that German language to be taught instead. Yeah, this is the reason why everyone is seated at the behind. The German teacher would arrive the next day, and as this was the last lesson in French, he wanted them to pay attention. So this is the reason. Now he is able to understand, Franz is able to understand that this is the reason why all the elders of the village are seated at the back. Franz was shocked to know that he could not learn French any longer and knew the latest news that had been put up at the bulletin board of the town hall. Franz regretted for not being serious towards studies and for wasting his time in hunting birds' eggs and playing in the Saar river. So this was the usual activity of our Franz. So he regrets. Till now, Franz considered his books to be an unwanted burden, but suddenly starts considering them to be his best friends whom he could never leave. The writer wants to show the change in Franz's attitude towards study after hearing the news that he could not learn French any longer. The news that their teacher, Mr. Hamel, was leaving also had a similar impact on him. Franz did not want him to go away. He no longer thought the teacher to be short-tempered and strict. Usually, Mr. Hamel would be very short-tempered and he was very strict. Now he has forgotten everything. Now Franz knew that Mr. Hamel was wearing his best dress in honor of this last lesson. He also realized that the village men had come to pay respect and thank Mr. Hamel for his service of 40 years in that school. He was working in the school for 40 years and he was teaching French in the same school. The village men had come to the class as they were also repenting for not having studied well in their childhood. Their elders also were repenting. They had come to thank the teacher for his 40 years of service as a teacher of French. Also, they wanted to show respect to their country and were sad as their mother tongue, French, would no longer be taught to them. The teacher calls out to Franz as it was his turn to recite the topic of participles. We already learned that Franz didn't know anything about participles. As the news had impacted Franz, he was very eager to study, and so he was desperate to show his eagerness. He wanted to be able to recite the topic in one go and without any mistake and please his teacher. His desperation is reflected in his willingness to give away all that he had in return for reciting the lesson well. As the news had impacted Franz, he was desperate to show his eagerness. He wanted to be able to recite the topic in one go and without any mistake and please his teacher. His desperation is reflected in his willingness to give away all that he had in return for reciting the lesson well. As Franz did not know the lesson, he got confused and stood quietly. His heart was beating fast as he was ashamed of himself and did not have the courage to face his teacher. Mr. Hamel said to Franz that he would not scold him as he had realized his mistake. Every day Franz told himself that he would study the next day, and now the opportunity to study had ended and he knew nothing. Mr. Hamel says that all the people of Alsace were to be blamed, as no one was serious towards learning. He tells the class that the enemies, that is Prussians, would laugh at them and say that they only showed to be Frenchmen, as they can neither speak nor write their own language. He says that Franz should not feel guilty as everyone is at fault. Mr. Hamel says that Franz's parents were not interested in getting him educated. They wanted him to work at a farm or a mill and earn some money. He says that as a teacher, he was also not interested in teaching them. He would send them to his home to water the plants. Sometimes he would declare a holiday and go for fishing. So he blames himself also. Mr. Hamel praises their mother tongue, French language, as being the most beautiful, clearest, and most logical language in the world. He tells the class to guard their language as it is the only way to free oneself from the prison of slavery. If a person knows his mother tongue well, no one can enslave him. Knowing the mother tongue well as a language is a tool to fight domination. The teacher took a lesson in grammar. That day, Franz was surprised that he understood the lesson with ease. He felt that he had been attentive and that Mr. Hamel also explained the lesson with a lot of patience. Franz felt teacher wanted to give them all the knowledge he had before leaving. After grammar, they had a lesson in writing. Mr. Hamel gave the class new notebooks with France, Alsace, beautifully written on them. Franz felt that here was an air of patriotism in the class. The notebooks were like flags of France that were floating all around. The entire class was busy writing, and the only sound that could be heard was of the pen writing on the paper. Once some mosquitoes flew into the class, but no one panicked as everyone was busy writing. The writer considers the pigeon sitting on the roof of the class to be the student as well, and says that even the pigeons were busy scratching the roof with their claws, and it seems that they were also busy writing the task of French language. The coo sound of the pigeon could be heard in the class, and Franz wondered that would the Prussian force the pigeon also to change their language and coo in German. The writer wants to say that language comes naturally to a being, and it cannot be forced upon anyone, be it to the pigeon or the Frenchman. In between writing, Franz looked at Mr. Hamel, who sat still and stared at the different things in the classroom in succession, as if he wanted to memorize the appearance of everything before leaving. Mr. Hamel had been teaching at the same place for the last 40 years. Yes, the only changes were that the desks in the classroom had worn out due to the use over the years. The walnut trees in the garden outside had grown taller. The hopvine on the outer wall of the school building had climbed up the roof. Franz feels that the teacher must be heartbroken to be sent away from the place, away from a place where he had spent 40 years of his life. The noises of his sister packing and moving their luggage could be heard from the room upstairs as they had to leave the next day. Mr. Hamel remained composed and heard the lesson from the entire class. After the writing task, there was a lesson of history followed by phonetics, where they recited the sound of alphabets. Franz referred to the class as babies because although they were grown up, they were reciting the lesson of phonetics, which is usually done by younger children. So he calls himself and his class to be babies. Hauser had put on his spectacles and, holding the premier in both his hands, recited the letters with the class. He was crying. His voice trembled as he spoke. Franz had mixed feeling. He found it funny to see how an old man like Hauser crying and trembling. On the other hand, he also felt emotional like Hauser did. Franz never forgot this last lesson. Just then, the clock at the church struck 12 and the prayer song began. At the same moment, the sound of the trumpets played by the Prussian soldiers who were returning from the drill was heard. Mr. Hamel's face became dull and colorless, as the time had come for the class to get over. He stood straight and motionless, and Franz says that he had never appeared to be so tall. Mr. Hamel began to speak, but he could not continue as he was overpowered by his emotions. He took a piece of chalk and wrote the words, "Vive la France," meaning "Long live France," on the board as large as he could. Then he stopped writing, bent towards the wall, and without speaking anything, he signaled the class to leave as the class was over. The author has expressed the true feeling of loyalty, duty, and concern of a teacher towards his people. So in this lesson, if you could just see, Mr. Hamel's duty and the concern towards the language and towards the people is clearly seen. The helplessness of the citizens and the unawareness of impending danger to the nation is portrayed well in this lesson. The last lesson summary reflects on the importance of one's language for any race and why it is crucial to safeguard it. Our memories of yesterday will last a lifetime. Dear students, I hope you have understood the lesson well. You go through this lesson again and again, understand them well, and prepare for your exam well. I wish you all the best. Thank you.